Hello, hello, hello. Apologies for the late start. Well, I'll explain why. It's very much worth it. We are very lucky to have two very brilliant guests. One of whom is out in the field in Gaza, so we just had to deal with reception and stuff, but we did it. So we're very, very, very excited to be talking today about what's currently going on in Palestine, in Israel, and as we all know, a ceasefire is supposedly tentatively in place. Now, why we're doing the show? This is why. Episodically, over the last few years, the plight of the Palestinian people is raised. It is discussed in mainstream circles. It is discussed to some degree on broadcast outlets, in newspaper outlets. And then when a bout of violence subsides, the Palestinian people suddenly disappear again. They vanish. We don't have discussions about the plight of the Palestinian people living under occupation, or indeed, as Human Rights Watch, perhaps the most mainstream international human rights organization, have put it, apartheid. So what we're going to do today is talk to two very, very courageous Israelis, one of whom is from B'Tselem, which is a human rights organization in Israel, extremely courageous human rights organization. It is not easy to be an Israeli human rights champion of the Palestinian people. And it's become harder and harder and harder. So we're very honored to have people who show such courage and dedication and determination against huge odds and facing terrible consequences, often personally, for the work that they do. And we're also joined from New York by Abraham Gutman, who was an Israeli refusenik. That's someone who did not, on grounds of conscience, join the Israel Defense Forces because of their objection to the occupation. Now, we've seen some horrific scenes over the last few weeks. We've seen a huge loss of life, and we know, of course, all loss of life is terrible, including the loss of Israeli lives. What we see from the death statistics, is what underlines what is often called an asymmetrical conflict. That is where one side vastly outnumbers in strength the other. But calling this a conflict itself is inaccurate, because one side is a military superpower armed and supported by the West, and the other is an occupied people who are not a military superpower armed and backed by the West. And we can see that in the horrific disparity in deaths. Huge numbers of Palestinians have died, including, devastatingly, many, many children. What we're doing today is talking about what's happened over the last couple of weeks, but we're talking in more depth about the nature of the occupation, about now that word, which is becoming increasingly mainstream, discussing what's happening in the occupied territories, which is apartheid. And what next? Is there any hope? Last week, we spoke to two very courageous Palestinian activists, one in occupied Jerusalem, the other, an 18-year-old girl in the Gaza Strip. Today, we're talking to two Israeli voices, as I've said, very courageous voices who have so much to say and from whom we're going to learn a lot. Before I bring them in, just quick housekeeping as ever. If you're watching this live on YouTube, click through to YouTube. Some of you aren't watching on YouTube. If you click through to the link, that just helps the show. Press like. That helps the algorithm, so more people will hear the incredible voices that we've got today. Also, do subscribe, click the notification bell. For those who are supporting this channel, I'm just a front guy with no technical ability. There's a brilliant team, including making the documentaries that we've been making, for example, recently about Hartlepool, which got a huge amount of praise, which the videographer rightly deserved. We're going to do many more of those documentaries, but it depends on, of course, your support as ever through patreon.com/OwenJones84. You can also support the show and ask questions to the guest by using Super Chat, which you can press below, only on YouTube. So do come through to YouTube. Okay, that's enough of me. We're going to go straight to our fantastic guests. I'm going to start with Sarit Michaeli from the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem. Sarit, it's such an honor to have you with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on with you as well, Owen. How are you doing?
Very well, and I hope you're doing well. Can I just check? You're in Gaza, is that right?
No. I'm in the West Bank, in the northern West Bank. As an Israeli, I'm actually prohibited from entering Gaza, and I've never been able to enter it by my own government, obviously now also by the de facto government of Gaza. I was in the northern West Bank this morning, out in the field, in an area northeast of Ramallah that is often the site of settler attacks, where settlers harass Palestinian shepherds. So they're kind of with some activists, and now just kind of like in the Nablus area.
So, firstly, many of the people watching or listening on the podcast will have heard of B'Tselem, but some won't have done. So, can you just explain who B'Tselem are and what work you do?
Yeah. So B'Tselem is an Israeli human rights organization that's been around since 1989. That's the kind of first intifada, first Palestinian uprising. It was established by a group of Israelis who reached the conclusion that there was a need at the time, we're talking about over 30 years ago, for truthful, accurate information about human rights violations by the Israeli authorities under the occupation. And that obviously was stemming from our basic belief, assessment, position that Israel is violating human rights, that the occupation and that Israel's actions within it violate the rights of Palestinians and violate Israel's obligations under international law. At first, I think the notion behind the organization was primarily that information is the basis for action, that if only Israelis knew what was being done in our name to Palestinians in the occupied territories, this will spur them on to act to end the occupation. You know, fast forward 30 some years later, clearly the occupation has not ended. On the contrary, the occupation is in fact more entrenched than ever. We, B'Tselem, not only Human Rights Watch, but B'Tselem views the situation now, not only in the West Bank, but under all the areas controlled by Israel. So basically in the entire region between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, as the situation of apartheid. And therefore, as far as B'Tselem is concerned, clearly this information in and of itself is not enough. It's still the basis of our work. We still provide accurate, timely, confirmed info about what's going on, but we also do much more advocacy, primarily with the international community in terms of advocacy, and with Israelis, so the Israeli public, to try and lead to international action that will end Israel's occupation and apartheid regime. As an Israeli organization, even though, and this might kind of like refer to some things we can talk about later, we don't see any way now that the Israeli government is going to accept any end of the current status quo, which is that Israel controls all areas and uses its control to promote its own interests. And therefore, even though we are extremely active with the Israeli public, and we do a lot of work to try and convey the reality on the ground of Palestinians living under occupation, and also our messages about the occupation to Israelis, we don't view this as something that could really lead to actual meaningful change. So this is kind of the work that B'Tselem does. You know, you described it earlier. Certainly we're not exactly the most popular organization in Israeli public life currently. But I also think it's very important to remember that we do represent, not in a kind of like political way, i.e. we don't have any kind of constituency that has elected us. We are self-appointed, but I think we do represent a large number of Israelis, both Jews and Arabs, who care about human rights, who want to end this reality. And we're certainly not a majority, and we're not, we're a relatively small minority in our own society, but we do exist here, and we try to make our voices heard.
But before I ask, just in depth about your work and what's happening on the ground, I mean, again, I have friends who went to Israel and proudly supported B'Tselem, but it's not easy, is it? And so I'm just interested, before I ask you, how hard is it to be someone like yourself and your colleagues to be able to do the work you do? What kind of pressures do you come under?
Well, I think it's quite a mixed reality. I would say that, first of all, I have to clarify that if I look at what my Palestinian colleagues go through, my Palestinian colleagues who are either Israeli citizens or residents of the West Bank, and certainly residents of Gaza, the hell they had to go through the last couple of weeks, and their reality, which is one of zero protection from, anyone, from the Israeli occupation, from their own government. I count myself extremely fortunate in that I have a lot of options. I have I have quite a wide scope to say what I think, to express my positions, and B'Tselem has quite a wide scope of operations. And we do enjoy a lot more freedom of speech and freedom of association than many other human rights defenders in our region and in the world. However, that is certainly not the only part of the only picture. The government of Israel and various government affiliated organizations are engaged in extreme campaigning and smear campaigning against human rights organizations or activists who are opposed to this to the status quo. So we certainly can speak our minds. That's not necessarily to say that anyone is actually listening to us, but because very often these smear tactics are quite effective in getting Israelis to turn off. The Israeli authorities have also in recent years worked to legislate against us. Primarily, the legislation has led to various bureaucratic hindrances to our work, right? To kind of like a lot more hassle to do our work, and this ongoing incitement against us. Many Israelis have been led to think that human rights organizations are the cause of
Hold on.
their troubles, that
We got you.
without people actually talking about this reality. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, we lost you slightly there, but carry on.
So a lot of Israelis think that without, so I mean, I think the sad thing is that on some levels, many Israelis think that without people holding up this mirror, right, without people actually reporting and discussing what's going on the ground, many of the things that they experience as a kind of like bad image or bad PR for Israel wouldn't exist. And this is absolutely absurd, of course, because the problem isn't the conduit, right? These Israeli human rights groups or international groups or the media. The problem is the reality. The problem is Israeli government policy, the policy of settlement expansion, and of the policy that makes Palestinians have no actual protection, there's no accountability for harm against them. And this is the problem. This is what people are seeing around the world. But I think that the Israeli government and many kind of like these self-proclaimed guardians of Israeli morality and etc., who attack human rights groups would like to blame the messenger. Obviously, I think it's been quite effective, but it's also been quite effective in galvanizing us and in helping us as a community of human rights organizations, not just B'Tselem, my organization, but a strong, very certainly not a massive, but a very committed community of people, both Israeli and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, who are working together to end this reality, to change this reality. And I think that if I think, this kind of recent conflict in Gaza, and I certainly take clearly the comment that this is not really a conflict. It's absolutely not even in any way. It reminds me of, unfortunately, the previous conflicts I've had to, or the previous rounds of hostilities that I've had to deal with in my job at B'Tselem, but it also reminds me of all of the attacks that followed, the attacks against human rights activists. And certainly the first one that was really the strongest was following the first large-scale Israeli operation in Gaza, Cast-led, which led to the Goldstone Commission report, and then following that to a massive attack inside Israel against human rights activists. And we've learned a lot since then, and I think we're very we've unfortunately had to deal with so many of these public attacks, and some of my colleagues also face individual harassment. Personally, I feel like I've not had to deal with a lot of that, but we are extremely united, and we're very unapologetic about the work we do, both inside Israel and abroad. So when I speak to Israelis, I tell them and I say it very openly that I also speak internationally, and our director has been to the United Nations Security Council to call for an end to the occupation, for the international community to do this, to take action. And we repeat this call again and again. As I said, naturally, and I think it's very understandable for people of any country not to be happy when someone holds up a mirror to them that shows a very, very negative image. But certainly I feel like, as an Israeli, I think it's not only my right to speak my mind, to try and speak the truth and report it. It's also my duty as an Israeli to speak to both Israelis and internationals and ask them to intervene, to take action to end this reality.
So, Sarit, just before the recent horrendous events, Human Rights Watch, which is an extremely mainstream international organization, they published a report which described the presence of apartheid. Yeah, and that's a word which people across the West obviously are very familiar with. It should be noted, of course, for a long time, actually, South Africa was an ally of the West and
of Israel.
And of Israel, of course. Yes. And actually, there was a lot of the way history is sometimes rewritten. It was, the people were always fighting against apartheid, and actually, it was a controversial thing to do for a long time, and people were very brave in doing so. Now, obviously, supporters of the Israeli government and of the occupation were very angry about that description. So, just tell us, based on your work, what are the why is that description, apartheid, so apt? What actually is on the ground to justify using that word?
So I think it's very clear, and I obviously I don't speak on behalf of Human Rights Watch, but I do speak on behalf of B'Tselem that made that specific pronouncement in a much shorter report. We issued a position paper about the entire Israeli regime between the river and the sea and B'Tselem, and it's not a legal document, right? We deliberately set out not to write a legal analysis, but a factual and moral analysis, looking at the reality between the river and the sea, in which two peoples exist, Israelis and Palestinians. Pretty much in terms of the numbers, there's a parity between the numbers of Israelis and Palestinians, but and we show very clearly in our position paper how on every level Israel has enacted a regime of Jewish supremacy. This means that myself, as a Jewish Israeli, I enjoy all the rights that a citizen in a democracy is entitled to, and that through a whole, through many years of policies and practices, culminating obviously in the nation-state law that was legislated in Israel and has created, has established Jewish supremacy as an actual principle, a constitutional principle of Israel. Through, as I said, the Israeli government, through policies and practices over the years, has created a situation where Palestinians are fragmented between many different areas in Israel proper, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and each and every one of those Palestinians receives specific and lesser rights and has access to lesser rights than any Jewish Israeli. And Israel has utilized its control over all Palestinians. I'm also talking about the Gaza Strip, control from outside, to prioritize its own interests, and certainly to take over land. And we discussed this whole issue of land takeover quite widely in our position paper. Now, we also state, and this I think is important, that we're not using the word apartheid as a clear and kind of historical analogy that is absolutely accurate to apartheid South Africa. Certainly, there are certain aspects of grand apartheid and certain aspects of petty apartheid that apply and that are quite prominent here. But the utilization of the term apartheid refers to a legal and internationally recognized and emerging notion that doesn't place apartheid only in the historical context of South Africa. And I think my understanding and from all of everything I've read and the briefings I heard from Human Rights Watch, they've been trying to do the same thing. Apartheid is also a recognized crime these days. And Human Rights Watch, I'm not saying that this is exactly identical to what we saw in South Africa, but that this is a violation of international law and reaches the level of an international crime that has, been described and is also dealt with today by the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into the situation in Palestine. It deals broadly with two issues, right? The issue of the conduct of hostilities and the issue of Israeli settlements. And these are recognized international crimes and violations of international law.
Just two other questions.
It explains the kind of like that it's not an absolute historical analogy, but certainly it refers to utterly unacceptable crimes.
Absolutely. Just two more questions. I know you're out, as you say, out in the field in the West Bank. Now, we all know the official Israeli narrative, which is Hamas is a terrorist organization, Israel is defending itself from attack, and this is a conflict in which Israel is exercising its right to self-defense. And that's the official Israeli state narrative about what recently happened. What's B'Tselem's take on what actually happened and the consequences for Palestinian civilians?
Right. So first of all, I think it's important to say that this is a straw man argument, because no one barring the most unacceptable positions internationally is saying that Israel doesn't have a right to defend itself. There's a big difference between saying that Israel has a right to defend itself and saying that the cost has to be about 250 people, including 66 children, killed in Gaza in 2 weeks, dozens of high-rise buildings, and tens of thousands of people losing their homes. So high-rise buildings brought down, bombings 24/7, hundreds of severely injured people, and an emerging COVID crisis inside the Gaza Strip, because there's been basically this entire 2 weeks has been a super spreader event. This does not. So B'Tselem would initially, first of all, say that when this is described as the only option for defending Israeli security, we would question this. Secondly, we've written and we are already in the process of researching the specific cases that we've seen and specific incidents we've seen over the past 2 weeks in Gaza. But B'Tselem described again and again how the large numbers of fatalities and civilian fatalities and the vast damage to infrastructure and to property in Gaza is the result of specific decisions, and those are political decisions about the open fire policy. So people are being killed and civilians are being killed because of political decisions about, for example, bombing the homes without giving prior warning, or those towers that have been destroyed were destroyed because Israeli politicians, decision makers, and also military of high-ranking officers and legal advisors reached the conclusion that this is acceptable, right? That this is a reasonable application of international humanitarian law, of the laws of war. And we show in previous reports and in kind of like a few emerging reports that we've already issued, how this analysis completely empties these laws of any kind of purpose and any kind of content, when the purpose of international humanitarian law is to defend and protect civilians. So we would certainly challenge the claim that this is, that this is an acceptable way for Israel to defend itself. Certainly, we've also denounced Palestinian rocket attacks at Israeli civilians inside Israel. The ICC, by the way, the International Criminal Court, is also investigating the conduct of Hamas and its own war crimes that it's perpetrating. But I also think that when we step back aside, it's always it's much easier to look at the last 2 weeks of hostilities, but why not look at the entire context of what is actually going on in Gaza. 14 years of Israeli blockade that has devastated the Gaza Strip, and this is on the following dozens of years of direct Israeli occupation and de-development of Gaza that have caused this the Gaza Strip to be what it is. We're looking at an Israeli policy now pretty kind of openly declared of dividing and fragmenting and weakening the Palestinian Authority and actually bolstering Hamas when it suits Israel, allowing funding to come in to the Gaza Strip, and also if we step back even kind of further and look at the entire area, the apartheid regime that has created a situation where these kinds of rounds of hostilities, where Israel views the entire thing as something that only has a military solution, which is obviously the opposite of what we would argue. There is no military solution to this situation. But this, this kind of apartheid regime that is establishing ongoing rounds of conflict, ongoing rounds of hostilities, which primarily harm Palestinians in a devastating way, but also harm Israelis. And I should also mention that in the last 2 weeks, we've seen an awful deterioration of the situation inside Israel when it comes to the relationships between Palestinian and Israeli citizens, or Palestinian and Jewish citizens of Israel. And I think when the entire picture is looked at, so the entire, I think the B'Tselem's analysis, which is now a much more broad and much more kind of like holistic analysis of the entire area and the entire regime, allows us to look at the reality in a very open and frank way, and to describe it also in a much more accurate and I think truthful way, but then also to demand holistic solutions to this problem. I certainly think that even now in Israel, and this is absolutely absurd and tragic and shocking, Israeli commentators who certainly do not agree with anything I would say, they are themselves talking about the next round that is bound to occur at some point, as long as this issue isn't addressed. So I think this really would be the essential, unfortunate and terrible prediction, that as long as the situation is allowed to continue in this way, the next explosion, the next round is only a matter of time. Now, I should also add to this picture the provocative actions of the Israeli government in East Jerusalem, the intention to remove Palestinians from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Now, another neighborhood of East Jerusalem is facing similar and even more severe actions. It's called Silwan, and dozens of Palestinian families are facing legal actions by Israeli settlers, supported by the state, and certainly working with all arms, all branches of the government to remove them from their homes. This is in Silwan in East Jerusalem. So all of these actions that are taking place, that are guided, that are assisted by the Israeli authorities, and that have contributed, and not even talking about the kind of provocative actions of the Israeli police in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, need to also be viewed in order for us to really understand and begin to offer solutions to what we see around us, to this horrific situation that we see around us, in order to not be in the same spot exactly in 3, 4, 5 years down the line.
Just finally, then, before I let you go, just firstly, what do you say when Israel says they have precision-guided weapons, for example, to avoid killing civilians? What's your response to that? But the final point is, I suppose, a desperate plea for some optimism, if possible, because it's very easy to look at this situation and think, what will happen now is Palestine will slip down the agenda. We do have a global, of course, the biggest global emergency since World War II. People will stop talking about the Palestinian cause. The settlements will continue to expand. Within Israel itself, it will become ever more a militarized society with civil society squeezed. The siege of Gaza will continue. The right to national self-determination for the Palestinian people will just slip away, and the United States, whoever is president, will continue to support and arm Israel, whoever happens to be in the government and whatever their policy is towards the Palestinian people. And you'd look at that and think there's no hope. And the campaigning work of people like yourself, as courageous as it is up against this absolute formidable, powerful force. So that's a bleak summary. But is there any possible hope for a just and lasting peace which provides national self-determination for the Palestinian people and a secure peace for Jews and Arabs alike?
Wow, Owen, so basically you've just described my list of nightmares, barring one. I could add to this, litany of horrors, also climate change and the way it's going to affect our region and the way that we as Israelis have managed to mitigate and will probably continue to manage to mitigate some of the worst impacts of climate change through our control of Palestinians. Just to give one example to illustrate this, there's an endemic water shortage in our entire area, and this is expected to become worse and deepen as a result of climate change. Israelis have more access to water. The way we divide water between ourselves and Palestinians is absolutely unfair. The shared water resources go primarily to Israelis, and Palestinians have an even worse water shortage. And this is in the West Bank. When you talk about Gaza and Gaza's water issues, the last 2 weeks have been absolutely awful because, for example, as far as I understand it, a desalination plant has been affected as well. But the water in Gaza is undrinkable and has not been worthy of drinking for many years, as is the entire Gaza Strip. There's this kind of it's become a cliche now. A UN report from 10 years ago saying that Gaza in 2020 will not be worthy of human habitation. Now, 2020 has long passed. Gaza isn't worthy of human habitations, but humans live there, right? So they do live there. It's not, they live in absolutely horrific and unfathomable conditions. It's unbelievable, and this seems to be, just deteriorating all the time. So, having said all of this, I'll maybe give you a list of a few of the things that I find currently optimistic about the situation that we are in. But first, I should also answer the question about Israel's guided missiles. So first of all, I think when you look at 66 children killed in Gaza over the past 2 weeks, this is the burden of proof is on Israel to prove that it has actually operated in adherence to the rules of international humanitarian law. And the suspicions that arise from this large number of fatalities of children, women, men who are not involved in the hostilities, at the very least require a very, very serious investigation that we know is not going to happen under the Israeli system, because we've researched and we've experienced the Israeli investigative system, and we have declared already in the past that it functions as a whitewash mechanism, not as a real mechanism to ascertain the truth of these kinds of Israel's military conduct. Also, additionally, there are already emerging there's already evidence and information emerging that calls all of these claims into great doubt. For example, when it comes to the media tower that Israel blew up, that Israel damaged, the Al Jazeera tower, Secretary of State Blinken said he did not see any evidence convincing him that that was a military target and an accepted military objective. Unfortunately, I really do not see any way that Israel will conduct actual transparent investigations into not only the specific conduct of individual soldiers, pilots, etc., but into the decision makers, into the military lawyers who approve these strikes. This is not ever going to happen, and it's a kind of like charade, a masquerade that is being performed by Israel in order to pretend that there is some sort of mechanism of accountability. Additionally, I think our past research into, for example, Operation Protective Edge showed, I think, quite conclusively how simply saying that you're taking all feasible precautions to avoid harming civilians, and yet again, civilians are being harmed again and again and again from those policies that you've decided on. It's all, things that are dictated from above. Those decisions are not made by individual soldiers or individual personnel. These are political or very, very high-ranking high-level decisions. The argument is not convincing when the argument is made, and yet civilians are being killed again and again, and this continues, and it has continued from the beginning of the current round and for its entirety. And one final thing is now information has emerged inside Israel and has been reported in the media that in fact some of the the targets selected were kind of primarily for show, for PR purposes, in order to threaten Hamas, in order to strike fear into Hamas, in order to teach them a lesson. These are, has slowly been discussed in the Israeli media. And again, I think, the onus of proof now is on Israel. I think it's very unlikely to be able to, I think it's very unlikely that the Israeli authorities will be willing to provide any actual convincing evidence. We would reject the legal analysis also that comes with it. Now, in terms of maybe just to finish on a positive note, I can give you a list of things that I've tried to cling to in the last 2 weeks to to make myself kind of like a little bit stronger. And I'm very glad you said, you described the conversations you've had with Palestinian activists in the previous program, Owen, because for me, that is actually the essential thing, that it seems like in the West and in the international media and on social media, Palestinian voices are being heard much more than they have ever been heard in the past. This is at least my personal experience. Of course, I'm an Israeli and I speak from my own perspective. But one of the things that have really been encouraging for me is to see throughout the world, certainly in the US, Palestinians raising their voices much more, reporting from the field, talking from, and broadcasting what is happening in Gaza. And this, I think, is really one of the first times that this has been on display so much. And listening to Palestinians and listening to what they are going through and what they have done, what they have had to endure for the last 2 weeks without some sort of like external kind of like resource like Israeli human rights organizations or the media, etc. I also think that I've taken a lot of encouragement from the kind of very strong voices, primarily in the United States, talking about the struggle against the occupation and against apartheid here in our region, but comparing it to the struggle for racial equality and justice in the US. And I think that listening to speeches by some really inspiring members of Congress and the Senate has been quite extraordinary and does indicate a change, as have some of the things I've heard from the US Jewish community that is going through a change itself. It started in 2014 and even long beforehand, but those things take time, but they are quite optimistic. Inside Israel, there have been dozens and dozens of protests and of demonstrations that are joint between Jews and Arabs, talking about not the kind of discredited word of coexistence. It's no longer considered the right term to use, but we're talking about partnership, right? About a shared future. And these demonstrations also are very inspiring and give one hope that there is a strong group of Israeli Jews and of Palestinian citizens of Israel who are not going to be who refuse to be carried away, to be feeling to be enemies of one another, and this has been quite helpful, I think, to kind of really resist, I think, a lot of this official incitement that has been extremely strong in trying to get Israelis to feel like the Palestinian citizens of Israel are enemies, are kind of like trying to, side with our enemies. And also speaking to Palestinian friends who finally, several Palestinian friends have told me that they feel that this is the first time in a very long time that Palestinians around all sides of the Green Line and in the Palestinian diaspora have been working together and have been kind of like trying to struggle for a shared future for a shared struggle. Those things have all been very, very encouraging to me in the last couple of weeks.
Sarit, we really, really appreciate you joining us like this. We've also flashed up the betsalem.org/donate page.
Yep.
I presume that's okay for international donations. I know sometimes there are rules.
Absolutely.
So it's www. For those listening, BTSELEM for mother.org/donate. Do support their courageous work if you can. That point about Palestinian voice is very important. As I said, we had last week 2 fantastic Palestinian voices. We also have coming up more Palestinian voices, including Bashar Murad, who's a brilliant gay Palestinian singer who we're very lucky to be speaking to in the coming days. But we really appreciate that, Sarit. It was so comprehensive, so detailed, and your courage and your insight really came through. And I've seen some of the comments. People were beyond appreciative of what you had to say. So we really appreciate it and your courageous work. And thank you for joining us at such short notice.
Thank you all, of course. And I would also, of course, we really appreciate your donations and we need this funding. But the B'Tselem website also has a vast amount of information. And we are going to be updating it probably on a daily basis from now, probably in the next few weeks, with ongoing information about the situation in Gaza and about the emerging results of our inquiries into the Gaza hostility. So I encourage you all to go in there and read the material we upload. We're also obviously available on social media. So aside from donations, which we appreciate immensely, we would also really appreciate that you read and look at our videos and kind of like reach out to us and get in touch with us. And thank you.
It really is a brilliant resource, and articles I've written in the past, I relied on B'Tselem's fantastic work, including what's on the website. So do go to B'Tselem. Follow them on Twitter as well. Very important resource there as well. Thank you so much, Sarit. Stay safe out there, and solidarity.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. So now we're going to go straight in to talk to our second guest, who we're really honoured to have, who is Abraham Gutman, who I think you're in New York, aren't you, Abraham? Let me just double check that.
I'm in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. What am I like? Philly. Sorry. Do apologise. Abraham, thank you so much for joining us. Big honour. So could you just talk a bit about your own story? Because you were born in Israel. That's right, isn't it? Just tell me about your backstory and I suppose your politicization.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me, Owen. So yeah, I was born and raised in Israel. I lived there, throughout high school and after. And I, around 2004, 2005, in high school, middle school, was getting more and more political, getting more and more involved in what I saw as just injustice and what I seem to be just didn't add up. I one of the a song that my father used to sing to us like as a lullaby had a reference to a place called Labis, and I remember him saying this is today Petah Tikva, but Labis, which is an Arabic name, doesn't exist anymore. So where'd it go? Like what happened? And so starting to ask these questions, starting to kind of notice what's going on around. There was the Second Lebanon War at the time that also involved military action in Gaza. There was a big debate about whether or not settlers should leave Gaza or not before the blockade, and really finding that a lot of the conventional, Israeli left narrative, or Israeli central narrative, I should say, didn't satisfy me. That the system itself was problematic, and it was not enough just to be a good actor inside the system. And that led me to decide to not join the IDF. There's a mandatory draft for everybody after high school when you're 18, 3 years for men, 2 years for women. And that was a tough decision. Just like Sarit talked, and that was brilliant. I want to center this around the fact that, the social sanctions I endured as an Israeli are not violations of my civil liberties, civil rights, freedom of transportation, freedom of speech and livelihood, and my ability to imagine a future for me and for my children. And so I do want to center this around the fact that the kind of sanction of speaking up is not equivalent to the sanction of just unfortunately being Palestinian between the river and the sea, depending on where, as Sarit said, the level of sanction kind of differs, but it's all terrible. But I chose not to join. It was the army. It was a long process of conversations with family, with friends. In retrospect, then I was very angry. I felt very unheard, and kind of feeling I'm doing something righteous. And now I understand that a lot of people, mainly my father, were really worried about me. It's hard to explain how much the army in Israel is a pipeline for social strata. That just like in the U.S. Someone for years can wear their college alumni hat, right, to signal, oh, I went to Harvard, or I went to this place, or I went to that place. And this football team that their college football team is still something that is important to them, and something that you forever can situate someone in a conversation as asking, oh, where'd you go to college? And actually you get a lot of information from the answer, right? You kind of have an idea of who you're talking to sometimes. Very much the same happens in Israel with the military. There are companies that say, oh, we have a ton of people that come from this unit of intelligence because they're super smart. And others, there's just so much of that going on. So many of my kind of friends, colleagues, in Israel at the time, found jobs through their former commander in the army. It's the club. People still tell kind of war stories, whether they're actual war stories or more like the boring, funny thing that happened in the base. So it's really a big part of Israeli social life. And I think that what I understand now is that the main thing that people like my father were concerned about is the fact that if I don't participate, I will forever not be a part of the club. That will forever kind of chase me. So there was a compromised position. So basically, to not join the military in Israel, there's generally two options. One is to object, which is what you kind of imagine, like Vietnam style arrest, right? Like you go to the day of your draft day, and you just don't agree to get on the bus, and then you go to jail for a week or two. They send you home, and they tell you, okay, come back, draft again. And it goes in circles, and people spend months in jail for making a political statement. And I admire them very, very deeply. One of the things that this gets is that usually it's covered, right? That there's media attention about the fact that there are people who don't serve, and there's a tradition of groups of 18-year-olds when they're finished the senior year, having writing letters such as that are called Michtav Shministim, which means seniors letter, like the letter of seniors from high school, explaining why they won't serve. And that does get a lot of attention, and it is an important and inspiring thing. Somewhat the compromised position in my family was to go another route, that to kind of reduce a little bit the social sanction. And I will ostensibly get out on a medical issue of mental health, that I, discussing kind of my own anxiety, and don't tell the Israeli army if they're listening, but maybe playing it up a little bit just to just to actually get out. And so I it's important to me to make that distinction. But still, after that, you're 18 in Israel, you're 19 in Israel, everybody sees you. I also look like the age, right? And people are like, oh, so what do you do in the army? Oh, what? This is the middle of the day and you're not wearing a green uniform. Like, why are you here? And it becomes a very isolating experience. And in Israel, just like people talk here about Dutch draft dodgers, there it's like people who evaded responsibility is the term people use. Like you don't do your part. And so I kind of volunteered as a medic for 2 years in like the Israeli version of the Red Cross. Yep, it's something that like continues to this day to by many. It's funny because when I talk to you, when I talk to Americans, when I talk to people outside of Israel, a lot of times me being in Israel gives me kind of positionality that allows me to speak with more authority about the crisis, about the oppression of Israel, about the crimes of apartheid that you all discussed before. But in Israel, a lot of times I don't get that position because I didn't do my part. So you didn't, so who are you to talk? And then that's where you see veteran groups as being like very effective internally.
So, I mean, we know throughout history, occupations, forms of colonization corrupt the occupier or the colonizer. So if we look at British colonization, it always rested on the dehumanization of the colonized. That was a prerequisite, because if you see those who are being occupied or colonized as equal to your own people, then one would not find that a tolerable, or they certainly less likely to find that a tolerable state of affairs. So I'm just wondering just about how that dehumanization works, how entrenched it is, how consequential it is within Israel. And also for those veterans, because I know, there are veterans. Breaking the Silence as an organization that organizes Israeli veterans. You do get those who do join and then see the impacts of the occupation and the crimes of the occupation and of apartheid, and it has an impact on them. What happens to those sorts of people? So I'm just quite interested in both how dehumanization works and the impact it has, which is very common in these forms of regimes, and that what happens to those veterans who see the impact and then speak out.
Yeah, so the Israeli army is a peculiar thing. On one hand, it's one of the maybe only armies in the world that by definition you're always at war, you're always at the front line. On the other hand, you can be on the front line for 4 days a week, 5 days a week, and then go home to your parents' house on a 25-minute bus ride, depending on where you're serving, which is just a bizarre to have such brutal militarization of another people. And again, we're talking about a size, all the river to the sea is about the size of New Jersey. Maybe this is not saying much to your audience, but we're talking about a very small territory. So the separation between, supposedly the front line and the separation and then where it's home is miles away in terms of the type of freedom and world and reality that you live, but at the same time it's really close. And I don't believe that doesn't that you can see that, you can experience that transition without kind of being desensitized to the fact that there's a door that you open, there's a line that you cross, and then it's okay. But it's very, very clear to you that this is not okay to you. And the dehumanization comes in a lot of forms, from active propaganda that we see, a lot of Israelis, Netanyahu, I think in 2003 or 2004, said at the time that, one day, like, we won't control the Palestinians. The actual threat to Israel as a Jewish state is the demographic threat, right? It's the fact that the population growth of Palestinian citizens of Israel are higher than Jewish citizens of Israel. So eventually, like, it will be really hard to maintain a Jewish democracy. And what is that calling kind of kids demographic threat, and kind of having that in kind of like, the national zeitgeist that you grow up politically in, that can't not influence how you view another people, right? That there's no way, there's no amount of like hummus plates that you can share in Jaffa, because that won't percolate into your consciousness. And you see this over and over and over again with infamously a few elections ago, Netanyahu said that the the Arabs are going to vote in droves, kind of like in a swarm like effect of be terrified, they're participating in democracy, right? So the logical conclusion, so to speak, is that eventually their participation in democracy is a threat to you, and that doesn't make sense because all people should participate in democracy. So maybe they're less people. And then there's another part of this that is sort of like an extra humanization, if that makes sense. And a writer who I rather not reference, to why I give a shout out, wrote a newsletter when the bombing in Gaza started, and she said that the death of Palestinian children is a tragedy, but it's an unavoidable burden of power for maintaining Zionism. So when you're essentially comparing, throughout crisis, you talked in the beginning of the show about asymmetry in casualties. And there's a piece that I'm writing that will come out next week, talking about asymmetry of even type of injury. You see, news organization report in the same breath that there were 66 kids killed in Gaza, 2,000 injured, another 250 something killed, Palestinian killed, and then there were dozens of Israelis who had panic attacks. And as someone who is in the mental health space, well, like that's important, but Gaza has 2 million people in it. If we try to tally the shock injuries of Gaza, that will be impossible, right? But only one side of this spectrum of this situation has the right to even have a shock injury. And that is dehumanization. When an Israeli army says that, leveling high rises, we are the most humanitarian army in the world. We, unlike Hamas, we give warning. We tell people that they can vacate their homes before. So the difference between, kind of a human and, an organism is that we extend beyond life, right? Like it's not only about breathing. So when allowing someone to live in homelessness is charitable because you didn't kill them, I think that speaks volumes to the type of mindset that someone can parrot that online, on the news, and you see the news commentator all the time. Look, they're saying we're doing this awful thing, but we warned them. So, and again, then comparing that kind of the idea that there's a collective trauma in Israel, which there is, but let's acknowledge that kind of, the reality of if there's a type of injuries that an Israeli can suffer, there's a type of Israeli that a Palestinian in Gaza can suffer. And then in terms of the yes, so I believe that the occupation corrupts us as a militaries are hyper masculine and are hyper militarized structures. They're violent structures. There is they're hierarchical in ways that are very, in my opinion, damaging in terms of our psyche, and I don't believe that you don't take that home, after. And I also don't believe that, just like people talk about how, universities liberalize people, I don't believe that armies don't do the opposite. Because being an 18-year-old kid with in the United States, you can't even vote. And you can't even drink alcohol. You can't vote. You can't even drink alcohol. Wearing a uniform and denying passes to a Palestinian that tries to go work through the checkpoint, who's your father's age, that's a power trip that no one should experience.
Absolutely.
In terms of sorry.
No, go for it, Abraham. Go for it. Go.
Just in terms of, I'll shortly speak. The attacks on folks and breaking the silence. These are veterans. A bit of a misnomer that I use because almost every Israeli is a veteran.
Of course.
But these are people who served in the military and broke the silence in what they saw. They lead tours in places like Hebron and Nablus to place that you can enter to Israelis. It's an extremely powerful voice where we need to be careful, including with me. And I really appreciate you, Owen, for having Palestinians before us, because usually the directionality is opposite. Usually I'm allowed to speak first because calling me an Israeli Jew and anti-Semite just doesn't land the same. And then people, graduate to having a Palestinian, which are the biggest authorities on their own experience and their own oppression and their own liberation, by the way. So the problem with me, in a sense, and the problem with the relationship like in the silence, is it does feed to the respectability politics of who is allowed to speak. So these are voices that we need. I think we need people like me who didn't serve to talk about why. I think we need people who served and saw to share their experience. That's critical. But we need to be careful that it's all done through censoring Palestinians, and it's all done through without creating barrier to entry to criticize Israel. I'm allowed to criticize Israel because I served is a problem, but at the end of the day, the right-wing people who are driving the propaganda don't make those distinctions, and there was brutal harassment, including billboards with names of Breaking the Silence leaders, chastising them as traitors. So they're extremely courageous people.
And just finally, but this is so fascinating. I'd ask you so many more questions, but I have to go and get vaccinated, funnily enough. So I have to leave in a few minutes, but which I'm very excited about. Just finally, I'm just interested. This time around, it does seem different. And I wonder why. I wonder if it's to do with Black Lives Matter and the impact BLM has had, particularly in the last, I suppose, year or so, really, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. But also, there is the rise of the US left. You have the so-called squad, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Jamal Jackson, Jamal Bowman. You've got a new, maybe that's part of it as well. And do you think this could be different, and actually maybe Israel's overreached and the global tide is turning and Western governments will find themselves facing more pressure in the way that South Africa ended up feeling more pressure, or their governments, Western governments, came under pressure to act on South Africa, which they did not do for many decades?
That's a very hard question to answer quickly.
Hey, sorry,
I will do my best because vaccination is important and good on you. And so here is the kind of how I think about this. We need to be both happy about kind of the change in tide and also be more honest about it. And I don't mean to like throw a blanket on this conversation or on the proposition. Most people started speaking after kids were killed. Condemning the death of kids shouldn't be a courageous moral act. That's really easy. Talking about the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, the expulsions, which is it's ethnic cleansing East Jerusalem by politically motivated abuse of racist Israeli real estate law. That's what we should be talking about all the time, because this is not new. There was just a Supreme Court hearing scheduled this time, and police decided to, crack down as much as possible, Israeli police, on protesters, which raised this to kind of international attention in some places. But you didn't see progressives, most progressives, talk about this in the United States when it was still Sheikh Jarrah. You saw this when there were, bombardment of Gaza, that the symmetry suddenly becomes so easy to capture without any political analysis. So we need people to be not afraid from political analysis. Calling for a ceasefire is not that hard. And unfortunately, it is when it comes to Israel for some reason. And I don't understand completely why, but we have to push further. This is why it's important that you're having this conversation. I also think that we need to be honest about who is talking and who talked from the beginning. Because it was Rashida Tlaib, one of the two first Muslim representatives in Congress, and a Palestinian that had to carry this mantle. It was Ilhan Omar, former Somali refugee, the other half of the first Muslim and of the pair of the first Muslim female representative in the U.S. Congress. It was Cori Bush, activist from Ferguson, where there was Palestinian activists. It was Jamal Bowman. It was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's a theme there. And one of the themes is that, there are also people who are people of color who are deeply immersed in racial justice fights in the US, just like the anti-apartheid movement was. You see also that the same in media. The people who have carried the flag to talk about this have not been the usual hosts of MSNBC, right? Some of the most watched shows haven't mentioned Palestine a week into the crisis. You've seen that now we have people like Mehdi Hassan, and Ayman Mukhadin, who have platforms. And there's this big question of like, did people change their minds? Or if these people were in power or had a voice or have a platform 10 years ago, because we had 2008, 2009, a war in Gaza that would look very similar. Nothing changed by 2012, 2014, you know? So like, would they have said the same things? Maybe. But they were blocked out of politics. They were blocked out of out of those platforms in media. They had to have someone have them as a guest, and then there would probably be another guest that says, well, I respectfully disagree. And so I think this is a lot of the fruits of organizing, of organizing on the ground, and of pushing, whether in politics or in media, to have different voices. And you also see that with what Sarit said about Palestinian voices in media as well, which I agree has been noticeable to me too. And then I do think now is the question. This is the inflection point, right? So the question is not what happened last week. The question is what happens next week. Sheikh Jarrah still is under threat of expulsion, of families in Sheikh Jarrah are threat of expulsion for houses they lived in for 70 years after they became refugees. So are people going to pick up this fight? And whether groups like AIPAC, suddenly their endorsement, which Barack Obama saw, Clinton saw, becomes toxic. So you don't want that endorsement for politicians. You don't do the pilgrimage yearly to their AIPAC convention because, you know, you don't feel comfortable being a party that someone like, his name escapes me, Trump lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, feels comfortable in, which he did until 2016. And so how do you become kind of that democratic party in the US? And how does the left kind of continue to push not only on Medicare for all, not only on Black Lives Matter, but also on Palestine, as a complete analysis, not only of what justice looks like, but also on what using funds, you know, for a just way. People always ask, how are you going to pay for it when someone raises a social policy? Well, got $4 billion for you sitting right here. So if not because it's the right thing, just do it for the money, I guess.
Abraham, we really, really appreciate you joining us like that. That was absolutely fantastic and so educational, so enlightening, and so full of humanity, which this conversation needs more of than ever. And to have that moral clarity when talking about oppression is a very important thing indeed. And you provided that in spades. So we really, really appreciate it. And thanks so much for joining. And everyone, please do follow Abraham Gutman on social media, on Twitter. What was your handle again, just quickly? It's I'm
at ABGUTMAN on Twitter. And yeah, I have a piece about many of these themes in Gaza and why we should keep talking about Gaza coming this week at Teen Vogue, and I would love to share it with your audience.
And I will share that on social media as well. But thank you so much, Abraham. I owe you one, and I hope when I'm not in New York, in Philly, sometime in the future, we can have a chat over a pint on the other side of this nightmare. But cheers, Abraham. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. Well, I better be quick because I do actually now need to go down the road and get vaccinated. Will it be Pfizer? Will it be Moderna? Who knows? Very exciting. Very quickly, just some quick admin. This book, We Can Do Better Than This, is coming out very soon. It's about LGBTQ rights and the future of LGBTQ rights. I've written a chapter on mental health. It's got people like Ollie Alexander, who you might have seen in It's a Sin, brilliant singer. It's got Phil Apuku-Gimya, she's amazing. Beth Ditto, so many people. So do get a copy of that. It's great. We've got loads and loads of brilliant interviews coming up, if I do say so myself. We've got, as I said, Bashar Murad, who is a gay Palestinian singer. Very lucky to have him. We've got so many interviews coming up. Do press the like button if you're watching live on YouTube. It helps the algorithm. More people hear the amazing guests we had today. Press subscribe. And also, if you support us on patreon.com/OwenJones84, we can do more of those documentaries, which I love doing, like we just did about Hartlepool, like we did about the COVID catastrophe, like we did about Amazon workers, like we did about the anti-lockdown protesters. You make those possible. Those guests were amazing. I learned so much. It was so informative. Want to just do a shout out for super chats. Thank you to John McKenzie, to Halimi Brewer, to Hugo Oliveira, to Mark Gorman, to Philip, Anthony Kenny, to FSM is the dog. Thank you so much for your support. You make this channel possible. I better run down the road now and get that needle in my arm. Lots of love, everyone. And I will see you in the week and next Sunday at 12 o'clock. Free Palestine.